Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work in the early development of larotrectinib?
Yeah. So I was involved in the phase 1 and also involved in the phase 2 Navigate study. And the phase 1 trial, we were not, the primary objective was really to understand the underlying toxicities. And at that time, it was not clear whether this drug would only work in NTRK fusion patients. It could have, there were suggestions that it could work in other tumor types without necessarily NTRK fusions. But we quickly realized that the patients and the drug that really benefited and affected were patients with NTRK fusions. And I remember seeing the first responder who still remains on the trial almost 5 years later. The scans, and she was a patient from Seattle, I think with Dr. Bob Doble at University of Colorado, who had this remarkable response. She was an undifferentiated sarcoma patient who had failed at least 3 lines of chemotherapy, and her lung scans, literally all her tumors disappeared in the first restaging. In most phase 1 studies, you're concerned about toxicity, and what we learned, and what is now borne out in larger data sets, and now many years, several years later, that the drug is incredibly safe. There are toxicities of some dizziness, fatigue, some mild nausea, but overall, these are grade 1 to 2 events at most. There is some percentage of the population, a small percentage of the population, do end up with liver AST and ALT elevations, but oftentimes these are reversible. You hold the drug and even dose reduce, and the patients recover and do well. And we have, even at lower doses than what is the prescription 100 milligrams BID, we have seen clear benefit with this drug.
And I know that with AST, ALT elevations, we see it across all the kinase inhibitors, these sort of transient ones. Can you talk a little bit more about the trial design? What were the inclusion criteria, and how are the populations included in the overall analysis?
Yeah. So the overall, the trial itself, the actual, there were again 3 trials: the phase 1 trial, the Navigate phase 2, which was called a basket trial. That meant anybody who had an NTRK fusion and different subsets of tumor types were allowed to enter the basket. And then there was a Scout pediatric study that explored different formulations, but particularly this drug in pediatric population. The trials from those 3 data sets were included in the final NDA application, breakthrough application, for the approval of larotrectinib. And larotrectinib's approval was really a many firsts. It was the first approval of a drug in both pediatrics and adults at the same time. It was also the very first, not necessarily the first histology agnostic approval, but the first genetic mutation or driver approval for any histology agnostic indication.
So for those populations, so we were talking about people who had already tested positive for a TRK fusion elsewhere, I assume, for the eligibility criteria, or in the original studies, you were saying that everybody was invited initially. Did that change? And you're talking
Correct.
about studies
in the
with
phase
children, different ages and things.
Correct. So in the phase 1, it was a typical phase 1 in the sense that it was an all-comer solid tumor study. But as we reached the expansion, and as we reached in the phase 2 Navigate study, it was restricted only to NTRK fusion patients.
Larotrectinib is one of the first examples of a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, a small molecule that's undergone accelerated approval, really based on marker-specific activity, responses that are seen across a broad swath of malignancies that all harbor a common molecular aberration, in this case NTRK. This marker-specific approval is tumor and histology agnostic, and that's what makes this approval quite unique. Because these markers, these rearrangements are rare, we'll never see a randomized phase 2 or phase 3 trial that'll compare it to standard treatment. The numbers are just too small, and frankly, based on response rates now that are about 75% across the board, based on protracted progression-free survival that at this point is probably going to well exceed a year, year and a half overall, and based on median survival that we haven't even reached yet, it's quite appropriate. I think it's safe to say, at least in the realm of lung cancer and other refractory malignancies, that this agent will easily surpass chemo du jour, any other empiric systemic approach that is equally or at least unproven to date. So in my mind, this sort of approval is completely ethical and actually absolutely necessary.